Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. A week or so ago, Mark Pellegrino and I, on our show, The Capitalist Corner, discussed an article from the American Institute for Economic Research. In the article, the author suggested that if most Americans would just learn Econ 101, we could get our compass as a country back and achieve some prosperity. Immediately after doing the show, I reached out to the article's author and I got him here today to discuss it for himself rather than have Mark and I trying to figure it all out. He's the founder and president of Ginn Economic Consulting, and he's also an associate research fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research. Vance Ginn, welcome to the show.
Hey, Michael, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Man, you have got a great radio voice. Like, I wish I had your voice. If I had your voice, I'd go straight to the top.
One day. I have my own podcast too, the Let People Prosper Show. And so I bring on guests and talk about it. And then I have one episode that's with a guest. And then the other episode is just me going on what's going on in the economy. So I love doing this stuff, as it seems like you do too.
I do. And I'm volunteering as a guest. No pressure.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about economics with you, but I want to get a good definition. What is economics?
Well, to me, I mean, you go into the textbook definition, economics is the study of using scarce resources efficiently and effectively. I taught that for a number of years out of the Greg Mankiw's textbook at Texas Tech and Sam Houston when I was teaching there. But to me, economics is the study of human action and interaction within institutions to satisfy our desires given scarce resources. It really humanizes it. Too often, people think about economics as being the stock market and this, that, and other money, but we got to look behind the scenes of who actually is trading in the stock market, who is, using gasoline in that market. It's people. And so I think if we get back into people, which my mantra that I always say is let people prosper, which comes through less government, I really think that should be the focus of economics, of really looking at how the study of how humans act and they interact in these exchanges.
That is a really good Misesian definition. I loved his definition from human action, that economics is the study of purposeful human behavior. So why did you become interested in economics?
Yeah, growing up in Houston, Texas, South Houston, low income family. My dad had epilepsy and they divorced when I was 5. So a single mom who dropped out in the 10th grade. And so she struggled for me and my sister to put food on the table, living paycheck to paycheck, all that sort of thing. And I wanted to find a different way, a better life, if you will, in some capacity. And I started playing drums for a hard rock band in Houston for a number of years. And then I got in a really serious car accident, May 25th, 2002, where I was life flighted to a hospital in Houston. And it just changed my life in the sense of, it gave me a purpose. I wish it wouldn't have taken that, but it gave me a purpose. And I felt like God's calling in my life was to let people prosper, was to help people in some capacity. And it turned me towards economics, man. I really just fell in love with it in undergrad in economics at Texas Tech University, and then got my PhD in economics there, and then worked in public policy for a number of years. And then kind of kept going. But I will say, you brought up Liebowitz von Mises. I mean, look, in my curriculum at Texas Tech, where I was learning, it was mostly Keynesian. I mean, most PhD programs are Keynesian, and it was really through the Institute for Humane Studies, the Liberty Fund, that sort of thing, that really got me steered more in the Austrian school, to where now, I'm a huge fan of the Austrian school, the public choice school of economics with James Buchanan, institutional economics with Douglas North, and the Chicago school with Milton Friedman. I just think that, to me, that sets the stage for good free market economics, to where you can really understand the principles. But at the end of the day, after all the studies I've done, I think the school of thought in economics that best teaches the principles is the Austrian school. I mean, they just lay it out so well in a way that I think people can understand, at the same time making it about what it really is, which is the study of humans.
Yeah, I'm count me as an Austrian.
Yeah, there you go.
There's a lot of people, they don't like Milton Friedman. I love Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
He got me interested in economics to begin with. I disagree with him on some things, but I still think he's ultimately a great economist, an absolutely brilliant man, as is his son David too. Is a very smart guy.
And Michael, I mean, I think one of the great things about Friedman, and I differ with some too with him, so I feel you on that. But I just love the way that he popularized things and could teach things to people in a way that they could understand without going too dense. Like Friedrich Hayek is also one of my favorite economists. I feel like he's too dense. It's tough to really dig deep into or get something on the surface what he's meaning. When you watch these videos of Milton Friedman, whenever he was just schooling these people in the universities, I mean, it's amazing how he could not necessarily cast them out entirely, but make it to where their points are just wrong and he's right. And I think we need more of that, not necessarily right and wrong, but just explaining things in a simple way. And I've been trying to get back to the basics, which is, this article you're talking about on Econ 101.
I sloughed through the Keynes. You mentioned Keynes earlier, the Keynes Hayek debates, and I also made it through the general theory of employment, interest, and money.
Woo.
And I had the same feeling while reading the debates between Keynes and Hayek. First of all, they keep saying the other one's misunderstanding what they're saying.
Yeah.
But I remember reading a quote from Frank Knight where, he basically says, I just wish someone would tell me in a plain grammatical sentence what the hell they're talking about.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult to grasp.
Yes.
But, one of the things that I really love about economics, and I loved it ever since I read Free to Choose. It was Milton Friedman, the first economics book that I ever read, was it seemed to me that there's an economic way of thinking, of looking at the world, a critical thinking approach. And I'm guessing you have the same idea. And I'm just curious if you had to summarize in a Milton Friedman, not a Friedrich Hayek way, how do economists think differently than most people think?
Yeah. I think that the main thing is that incentives matter. And we live in a world of trade-offs. And so we are the ones, economists are the ones that are considering those trade-offs, the seen and the unseen, that really no other subject, no other major that you could get in looks at it in the same way. And to me, that is the economic way of thinking. How are people going to behave given different trade-offs, given scarcity, given opportunity costs, all those things? Those are really the basics that makes economics different compared with anything else that I think you could study.
That's absolutely fantastic. I love it. Henry Hazlitt, the seen and the unseen, I think is absolutely fantastic.
Michael, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt is like the #1 book that I tell people to read. If they don't have any other insights on economics, they should read that first, and then probably Free to Choose. But I love that book, Economics in One Lesson.
So, another, speaking of Keynes, Henry Hazlitt's book, The Failure of the New Economics, I'd recommend that to anybody. He absolutely destroys Keynes basically on a page-by-page basis. So the article that you wrote talked about how to get us back, set our compass straight. If people would just learn, and you put forward 20 sentences, and we can't cover them all today because we're time limited, but I do want to cover a bunch of them. But before that, I got to ask, what do you think are some of the myths that people believe, there are a lot of people believe, because of a failure to understand economics?
The first one that comes to mind is what I believe is a myth is market failure. People perceive market failures all around us, and that gives them a way to devise government to come in and quote unquote fix the market, solve the problem. And I think that's just a myth. I mean, when you look at market actions, remember, markets are nothing but people acting purposefully, what we're going to talk about today, and only exchanging if they mutually benefit. If they don't, then they don't exchange. And so me as an economist, the only way that I know whether or not somebody was going to improve their situation in life is because they acted. And so I think going back to this idea that there are market failures is a myth, because people act purposefully in their behavior, and the government is the one that often creates the quote unquote market failure because of government action, whether it's the Federal Reserve, which should end, or whether it's government spending by Congress, spending on many things they shouldn't be doing, or taxes. You oftentimes see that the market failure is on the surface, again, the scene, but underlying that are many government failures. And so to me, the biggest myth is that markets fail. They don't fail. They just happen to maybe not have the exact outcomes that people want, because people are dynamic. People change and they act in different ways.
So you mentioned just now, and it was actually, I believe, number 2 on your list, and I left it off because I have a slight disagreement with you, and I want you to tell me now, since you mentioned it. I want to see if I'm wrong or maybe I'm misunderstanding. You said that whenever there's a trade, both people benefit. I think it would be more accurate to say that people wouldn't trade unless they perceived that they were going to benefit, because I could be wrong, right? I might go and trade for a beverage that I think is going to quench my thirst. So I go get it. Turns out it doesn't. I made the exchange, but I was mistaken. Would it be more accurate to say no trade can happen unless both parties approve of the trade and perceive a benefit to themselves?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think I was probably trying to shorten it a little bit, but I think I'm probably in the same boat as you are with that. I think that's good economics, and I think that, the way that I think about it, without getting too technical and digging deep, is you have marginal cost and marginal benefits. Well, marginal benefits are the additional satisfaction you get from acting, from whatever decision you make, and the marginal cost are the additional unit of cost of those actions that you take. And in basic economics, they'll say, well, you act whenever those two things are equal. And I don't believe that. You only act if the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. And so I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is that both the marginal benefits for the two in the exchange will be better off than they were before. And maybe it's just a perceived better off, even if the, quote unquote cost that we're able to calculate somehow, which I don't think you are, but if you're able to, it might actually show, well, no, you weren't better off. And the other part on that point, though, Michael, is that it's always the perception, which I think is a good point that you make there. Maybe I need to go in and redo that list, because is it from you, the people that are in the exchange, those two in the exchange, or how many ever there are, or is it the perception from a third party? And what I've seen in like behavioral economics in particular is they'll say, well, these people in the exchanges aren't acting in their own or they're not acting to where they're both benefiting, and therefore there's a market failure. We need government to step in. But it's always on the behalf of a third party making that decision that they weren't acting rational and they weren't benefiting. It's not from the individuals in that exchange. One quick example would be, what about exchanges for illegal drugs, for heroin, for something along those lines, right? My argument is that I can only, as an economist, I can only experiment or examine how they acted. And the person bought the heroin from the drug dealer, and so therefore they both mutually benefited. Now, I could come back in and say, well, yeah, but heroin's bad for you, blah, blah. Well, that's from a third party making that decision, not from the people within the actual exchanges. And so that's where I kind of get back to, I think you're right, though. The perception is really important there.
Well, it's an excellent point you just made, though, because if an individual can be mistaken about what's best for him or her, then how much more so a third party, right?
Yes.
The individual is in the position who knows all of his or her values, beliefs, attitudes, cravings. That person's in a better position to know than any third party. And you made an awesome point just now, because I remember very recently I had a debate with some Marxists.
Okay.
And I was reading Marxist literature, and they talked about value exchange. And they said exchange happens when the values are equal. But no, that would be, why would I put the effort into action if I was going to end up in the same position I am now? Yes. I only act if I think I'm going to be better off. Otherwise, I would just sit here.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And that brings me to your very first principle on your list, is that people need to know is that people act with purpose. So what do you mean when you say people act with purpose?
Well, it goes back a little bit to what we were just talking about, is that we act in order to satisfy our desires. We want to improve our situation. I remember whenever I'm teaching a class or a group, I'll usually be standing there, right, talking to the audience, and I'll tell them, hey, look, I'm not going to move one step forward unless that's going to benefit me somehow. What it means is that I don't like where I'm at now. So we act purposefully to improve our situation in life. And that comes from a lot of different ways. To your point on what their preferences are, their cravings, all the other things that are out there will be in the back of their mind, the information they have when they make that decision, but it's still purposeful in that sense. and I don't know where you are on religion or anything, but I'm a Christian. So I also believe that there is a God-given purpose for us. And so that purpose is also driven to what we're going to be doing in the future. So it kind of pulls the two together between economics and some of the religion sort of part of me to get into that. But I do think we all act purposefully, whether you believe in religion or not, that we act purposefully to improve our life.
Yeah, all what's the word I'm looking for here? Reflexive action is a person acting with intent, with purpose, to substitute a state of affairs that I believe is going to be better than what my current state of affairs is. Now, in order to do that, I have to understand cause and effect, right? I have to understand that certain actions are likely to bring about certain events. Otherwise, I couldn't behave. You know, I have water on my desk because in one of my early interviews, I ended up having a coughing fit. And I realized, wow, I wish I had water. And I also learned how to use the mute button.
Yeah.
But if I couldn't, if I didn't understand the cause and effect relationships involved, I couldn't act. And now you made a point too about how people feel about uncertainty. And you write that people dislike uncertainty. Now, to me, if people dislike uncertainty, right now is not a very good time, right? Because we have a president who keeps changing, for instance, on tariffs, what we should do here, what we should do there, and that leads to uncertainty. Yeah. But explain to us what exactly you mean when you say people dislike uncertainty, and why do people like uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think, even I've got 3 kids. And so as soon as one gets sick and they're staying home, then that brings about uncertainty just in my daily plan. How I'm going to work from home and do podcasting and all the stuff. And so uncertainty not only can break up your personal life, but then also your professional life. I mean, employers, and one key thing, a lesson from Austrian school that's so important is entrepreneurship, which we could talk about more. But the entrepreneur needs to be able to look and see what the forecast is for their expectations about profit and loss. And if they don't understand what their costs are going to be, or they have more uncertainty about their revenue stream, then that will change up, distort, create malinvestments, if you will, going to Austrian school, malinvestments that will distort the economy. And so that uncertainty brings about a lot of the lack of being able to plan from one day to the next. I don't mean government planning. I mean for individuals and businesses and employers and entrepreneurs. Those are the ones who need to have some sort of ability to look in the future. But also uncertainty brings about new ideas. So whenever you have uncertainty, you're going to have profit and you're going to have losses. The losses are just as important in a free market capitalist system as are the profits. And that's one reason why socialism fails, is because there's never this profit and loss sort of situation. They want you to continue to profit, quote unquote profit, which creates more inequality, less economic growth, more poverty. But in a system of free markets, you're allowing for that profit and loss really to drive learning opportunities for the future. And I think that's where uncertainty can really come in. But I also was thinking about what you were talking about, though, too, with Trump's tariffs. I mean, the on again, off again sort of approach. Is it 10%? Is it 25%? Is it 50%? Those are direct effects on the profit and loss expectations, the uncertainty of the marketplace. And it's one reason why I think it's done a huge cost. We may not see it in inflation numbers because tariffs don't drive inflation. That's from money supply growth, but it does distort the relative prices and distorts a lot of other things throughout our economy. So long story short, though, Michael, is that the uncertainty breaks down the profit and loss mechanisms in our individual life and in our professional lives, and therefore causes problems for the overall economy.
I'm so you jumped ahead of me, but it's okay because it's good to talk about. You talked about inflation comes from money creation, not from tariffs. I got skewered recently on social media over this issue. So on my show that I do every day, the Capitalist Corner, we were talking about tariffs, and I said and I brought up that it is an absolute myth that tariffs can cause inflation. Now I'm using inflation as is commonly used now as a general rise in prices. Some people wanted to argue, no, inflation's an increase in the money supply beyond what's needed. I happen to agree, but I also know that it's impossible to communicate and have a conversation if I'm going to stall it and jump from what everybody else means about a term and use it the way that I want to use it.
Yeah.
So going as a general rise in prices, I pointed out, I said, look, all you have to do is do a mental experiment where the money supply is held constant. If the price of one thing goes up, if people want to continue to buy that, then the price of everything else, or not everything else, but something else has to drop.
Yeah.
Because there's not enough money available for that. And I said, more to the point, if people could be just pass off the price to consumers that way, they would already be charging that. Why would they leave profit on the table?
Yeah.
Now, so I talked about how the reason that tariffs can lead to a rise in prices is because now if a producer has to pay more in taxes, he has less to put in investment, and you're going to get less of a supply of a product. All things remaining equal, the price is going to go up. And so many people, I made a clip and I posted it to TikTok, came in, you need to study Intro to Economics 101. And they told me all the economists disagree with you. I said, name one.
Yeah.
Just tell me one that's going to tell you that. I understand when you're watching your nightly news program,
right,
that they'll say that because it gets around the extremely high-tech analysis that you have to do. You just say tariffs are going to increase prices, which they will do on the tariff product, usually, right?
Yes.
But when you say that only monetary, only money inflation can cause price inflation.
Yes.
Of course, Milton Friedman said inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. What do you mean, and why is it the case?
Yeah. Great points there, by the way, Michael. And I struggled with a lot of those folks as well, because there's a lot of them out there, especially when I was at the White House. You had Peter Navarro. I worked in the first Trump administration from June 2019 to May of 2020 as the chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget. So I was in the White House complex at the Eisenhower Executive Office building. I could go in the Navy mess and the West Wing anytime I wanted. It was fun in that sense. But it was a struggle because of the lack of economics, or the misunderstanding of economics that went on, and it's still there today, unfortunately, especially on the tariff stuff. But look, money creation by the Federal Reserve that's not backed with some increase in supply of goods and services, you're going to see more inflation. And I really like to look at, there's a lot of talk right now too, Michael, about the Federal Reserve should lower their target interest rate. They have their federal funds target interest rate, 4.25 to 4.5% right now. That influences a lot of other markets throughout the economy, and they don't control interest rates, but they target them. But to me, that's all a side effect. That's noise compared to the real control is of their balance sheet. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet is the high-powered money, the base money, as Milton Friedman would talk about. And that comes from buying assets, quote-unquote assets, or debt, from the Treasury Secretary or the Treasury securities or mortgage-backed securities. They have $6.6 trillion now on their balance sheet. Back before the financial crisis in 2008, they had an $800 billion balance sheet. And then it went up to $4 trillion over time during the financial crisis and everything. And then you fast forward to COVID, it went from $4 trillion to $9 trillion, $5 trillion increase in their high-powered money. And then they wondered, some said this was going to be transitory inflation during COVID because of the supply shock. And I was always saying, look, that's nonsense, because the Fed has printed so much money and there's not the increase in supply of goods and services. We're going to have persistently higher inflation. And that's exactly what we had. And it continues to be high. I mean, the core, the PCE, personal consumption expenditures, they exclude food and energy, which of course we all buy, but they tend to be more volatile. That's up 3.1% over the last year, which is well above the 2% target inflation rate that the Federal Reserve would like to see. So we're not done with inflation now, and it's because the Fed's balance sheet they put too much money into the economy, and we haven't had supply increase at the same rate. And we're going to continue to see more inflation, not from the tariffs, which you correctly pointed out, but because the Fed can't get control of the money supply. And even if you look at M2, so there's these broader measures of money, M2 is up 4.5% over the last year, the highest since July of 2022. And that's when we saw 9% inflation. So I think there's still a lot of inflation that's out there. And it goes back to this rule, this principle that money supply increases are what create inflation.
This guy talks a little bit about it in here. Have you seen this book before?
Oh, yes, of course. Of course. That's a good one.
Just to complement that, I also have this from Murray Rothbard, A History of Money and Banking.
Yep. Another great one. There's another good one too, Money on Credit by Mises, where he digs into this stuff too.
I have that. I've read that too. I don't know if I have it up here.
Okay.
Yeah, Theory of Money and Credit. Great book. Absolutely love it.
Oh yeah.
So you also talk about that entrepreneurship drives growth. I'm hoping you're going to bring in Israel Kirzner, but no pressure on this. But Israel Kirzner talked about entrepreneurship as a discovery process.
Yes.
That entrepreneurship see opportunities and they go in there and they meet them. And what that means is they see where people need things or where people want things, and they direct their energies in those directions. So when you say entrepreneurship drives growth, what do you mean? Because I'm guessing you don't just mean it drives growth for the entrepreneur as he's making profits.
Right. No. It definitely goes along with the Israel Kirzner, but his teachings are, I've read a lot of his stuff, and Peter Bettke at GMU, George Mason University. He's one of my favorite living economists. He talks about Israel Kirzner all the time, and that was one of his main teachers. And so on my podcast, Life You'll Prosper show, I've had Peter Bettke on twice, and we've talked a lot about Israel Kirzner. But yes, it's about the entrepreneurship that they're creating, not just for themselves. People want to act selfishly, but remember, people also want to be loved, and relative to just being lovely, as Russ Roberts likes to talk about Adam Smith and his works on there. But entrepreneurship is looking at what are the openings in the marketplace. Where are the profits? Where are the losses? And they're able to put information and resources into those directions. I think it's also important to separate out a capitalist versus an entrepreneur. A capitalist is one who's able to finance certain things to get things done. An entrepreneur is the one who says, this is the direction we need to go. Now, sometimes they could be the same. I would consider Elon Musk to be an entrepreneur, but he also has the financial capital to be a capitalist in the process. But first and foremost, I really believe he was an entrepreneur that happened to get him the capital he has today. And that's what we want more of. It's one of the reasons why, Michael, that I believe in the rule of law, right, in America, but I also believe that we need more legal migration. We need more immigrants in America, not fewer. And we just need to stop chastising one group versus the other, because we get a lot of entrepreneurs moving here from other countries. We shouldn't just worry about the 330 million people, but the 8 billion people across the globe. And when you start thinking in those terms, entrepreneurship drives growth, because if without the entrepreneur, we are going to be doomed for failure time and again, because that's what happens in socialism, communism, all the other isms besides capitalism that you really see across the globe and throughout history, because the entrepreneurship isn't allowed to flourish. And so that goes a lot into the school and the teachings of Israel Kirzner.
When you mentioned immigration just now, that's huge to me, because that's an area where I find so many people are so misinformed.
Yeah.
The first time I really ever read a great argument that was pro-immigration was from Julian Simon. And Julian Simon talked about the more people come in, the better off you are, because it was in the name of his book, The Ultimate Resource, which is ultimately the human mind.
Yeah.
So people think in terms of, well, if you allow these immigrants to come in, they're taking jobs, but they don't think in terms of the immigrants that are coming in that are creating jobs, that are starting businesses, that are coming up with ideas. And, through the works of guys like, Don Boudreaux, who I got to interview, and I was so excited I got to interview him recently. He changed my mind also on immigration years ago through an article he wrote on the unconstitutionality of federal immigration laws. And he was right. And I looked into it. And then looking into Brian Kaplan and Alex Nereste, both of whom I've been very fortunate enough to interview. And the data just don't back up the idea that immigrants are bad for the economy, that they're siphoning off welfare benefits, that they're committing crimes, but people continue to believe this stuff. And it doesn't matter. It seems like, they'll say, well, even if they have lower crime rates, one crime, even if they just commit one crime, one murder, that's too much. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. But if we're going to regulate our lives that way, and Brian Kaplan pointed this out to me, adolescent and young adult males commit most of the crimes. So if one crime is really too many, we could just nip that in the bud by outlawing them from going out on the streets.
Yeah.
But we quickly see, the cost is too high. Human life comes with risks.
Yes.
And we're willing to assume those risks for the sake of freedom and all the benefits we get. And you can't just say, well, there was this murder that an immigrant committed. You have to look at all the costs that are going into keeping them out, all the uses of force that are happening, and all the benefits that we're doing without by not letting them come into the country.
Yeah.
So you hinted at this earlier, and this to me is straight from Mises. I got it originally. I learned about it from Milton Friedman, that prices send signals, but nobody hammered it home to me as much as did Mises in his seminal work, his absolutely phenomenal work, Socialism.
Yeah.
Price signals matter. Why? What are price signals? What is the signal that they're sending?
Yeah. So prices are a part of the market process. And I think that's one thing important here is that in economics, we often will learn that there's this equilibrium price and everything works great and it's right there, the supply and equal demand and all the things. But really, we have a dynamic economy that are constantly moving. And so prices are the signals to consumers, whether they want to buy something or not, and to suppliers, producers, whether they want to supply or not. And so those prices are essential for a well-functioning market economy, or just any economy in general. And again, it's why socialism fails, because you have a top-down group in the government that's deciding what the prices are or what the supply is, versus allowing for the entrepreneur, going back to that again, and people acting purposefully as consumers and producers to come together to indicate what that price is going to be. And so to your great discussion there about immigration, I think some people will just assume that the price is too high for those immigrants to be here, but they don't look at the entire part of the market process to see what's going on. So for example, to stick with this analogy here with immigration, is that yes, when you increase supply of workers, then the price of labor will, all things being equal, will go down, right? Wages will go down. But remember that those same workers are also on the demand side. They're consumers. And the market is not one labor market. It's low skilled all the way up to high skilled labor in that marketplace. Well, most of the immigrants that come here, especially places like Mexico and Latin America countries and South America and things of that nature, are going to be in the lower skilled level. So they compete with that particular part of the low skilled workers across the economy, but they also buy a lot from those low skilled locations, like Walmart, for example. They have a huge increase in demand, so the demand is also shifted to the right. Therefore, the prices come back to where they were before. So what that indicates is that it's not just about what the immigrants do to the labor market or the economy. It has to be something else. And that something else to me is where people just get frustrated that something seems wrong and they need someone to blame. And whether that's China when it comes to trade, or people from Mexico, for immigration, but it's like they have one finger pointing at others, but there's three more that are pointing back at them. And what I think prices do is to better help us to decide how we should proceed as entrepreneurs and consumers and everything else, and look at immigration as a market to determine whether or not these are good or bad overall at the end of the day. And I think that more immigration is much needed, along with more trade internationally, and prices help to tell us more about that, gives us more information in the marketplace.
Now, when you just to clarify, when you say demand shifts to the right, you're talking about demand curves. You're not talking about Republicans buying more stuff.
No. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Demand curves.
When it comes to this issue of it goes back to the calculation debate in socialism, that economic calculation is impossible because the lack of prices, the lack of signals. But I've heard a lot of people, they say, well, we're more advanced than we were when Mises wrote that, and now we have computers. But my response is, well, unless computers can not only read minds, but guess what the future minds of people are going to be thinking, then the computer can't do it either.
Yeah,
because the computers do not know what people want, and that's what prices are telling. Telling entrepreneurs and telling consumers. This next one that I'm going to get to, to me, it has personal importance because it's an opportunity cost.
Hmm.
An opportunity cost basically means that what you choose to do is at the expense of everything else that you could be doing. And when I was going through I was a criminal and I had to rehabilitate myself, I had to learn this, that when I choose to do one thing, I can't do other things. And it allowed me to learn about time management, about the hierarchy of values that were going to guide my life. And I'm very happy to have you explain it. When you say every choice has opportunity costs, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it quite well. It just means that you have to give up something else. And in economics, opportunity cost is the next best alternative. So, you and I are recording this right now. There's a lot of other things I could be doing. I could be eating lunch. I could go somewhere with my wife. I could spend time with my family. But I want to be here. This is what I value more than anything else. So in opportunity cost, those decisions, those choices that are being made have to be made it's not in a vacuum, that there are scarcity. So time is scarce. So every decision I make has an opportunity cost. We're giving up something else. And I think that's usually where I see the light bulb start to go on for students in economics, is that no other subject talks about that. That, in psychology, you kind of have this discussion about in the mind, what you're thinking and how you're behaving, but not necessarily what the trade-offs are given each one of those transactions. And I think that's where economics does a great job of taking an extra step forward. We're from folks like Mises or Carl Menger and others that are out there, because it does say that there's an opportunity cost. And it's also why Milton Friedman went by and said, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Right? Is because anytime you see something that's free, there's somebody paid for something somewhere, or they had to give up something in order to put it there. So as soon as my kids say something is free, I'm like, well, no, sorry, that's not free. There's always a cost associated with that. Nothing is free, and that is where I think these choices, and given scarcity and given these opportunity costs, are very important in every decision we make, whether they be in our personal lives, like your story or my story on the decisions that I made over time, which weren't always the best, but hopefully we learn. And even though there are these opportunity costs along the way, hopefully through cumulative learning, which I think is a big part of being human and understanding and adapting to things over time, it allows us to better prepare ourselves for the future. And I think that's where these opportunity costs and understanding them really come in.
Okay, the last one I want to cover, and by the way, I'm not covering all of them, so I'm going to recommend that everybody in the audience. Matter of fact, when I post this up, I'm going to include the link to your article, Econ 101, A Compass for a Lost Country, because it needs to be read so you can get all of them. But the last one that I want to cover today is the myth that government, well, no, it's not. The myth is that government spending can create wealth. But the way that you phrased it is government spending can't add to the economy. But we always hear that it can. I mean, government spending's counted in GDP, right? Where the multiplier, that's supposed to be in full effect. So why can't government spending add to the economy?
The simple point is that government has no money. They have no money, and so they have to steal from us. And I believe strongly in the non-aggression principle, that they should not be stealing our money along the way. But since they don't have any money of their own and they have to steal it from us, they can't create value. You can't take from someone and create value into something else. That's magic, which I guess Keynes thought that the government could do. But there's always that opportunity cost. There's always something else that's taken out of the system, meaning our taxes, to pay for something else. So what you see from government is how much they spend on national defense, how much they spend on Medicare and Medicaid, and then we see the outcomes that come about there. What we don't see is what that money could have done in the productive private sector, in the hands of families, in the hands of entrepreneurs and capitalists in the economy. Those are what we're missing out on, are the unseen, which are much more costly to have missed out on than the provisions that are being forced on us by government. And look, I'm a limited government person, probably compared with most people, very radical in some sense. I think we should have national defense, a core system, and maybe a couple of public goods. So instead of spending $7 trillion a year, I could easily, in my mind, get it down to $1 trillion, if not less. But we built up the situation where I think people believe that government does increase economic output through Keynesian economics. And that's what we hear from politicians. We just need to spend this money. We need to cut these taxes. Well, if you cut taxes, you probably should cut spending too. And if you increase spending, you're probably going to need to raise taxes, because that government debt also is a cost to us through higher interest rates, higher inflation. All these things create a situation where government can't create wealth. It can only destroy wealth. It can hopefully preserve liberty, which I think is it could be a good purpose for it. We just have to be very careful about that, because even in our national defense, there's a lot of inefficiencies. There's a lot of waste, even in our national defense. And so I think that there's areas to cut there. And so the more that we understand that government spending is not creating wealth, the better off I think we're going to be fiscally and economically and even individually. You know, one thing that worries me a lot, Michael, is that the government has crowded out the productive private sector so much through nonprofits and charities. Those used to be the bedrock of how we'd come together within communities. And now we have these books like Bowling Alone and others saying people are being isolated more. Well, it's a direct result, in my view, of all the government expansion. Why would we come together and congregate if the government's going to do everything for us? Now they're trying to parent us and say you can't watch this and that, and everything's getting banned. I'm in Texas. They're trying to ban everything, it seems like. And more liberty is what brings about more economic growth, not more government.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. Now, where can people find you?
Yeah, best place is vanceginn.com, VanceGinn. That's my website. I also have a Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com, which you can find on my website. And I post a lot on X about what's going on in the economy. And then I write for the American Institute for Economic Research and a number of other organizations. But vanceginn.com would be the first place.
Awesome. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. And for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.